If you want to understand the next potential global crisis, you don't really need to read all the frantic headlines or listen to every political pundit. Turns out, all you really need is a map.
Yeah, let's dive into that. Because that map, the one showing the geography of the Middle East, it basically dictates the entire logic of any potential conflict there. It shows us exactly where the pressure points are, where the weak spots are, and really how a small regional fight could just spiral into a global catastrophe. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a 4-part journey to really get this. First, we'll see why geography is pretty much everything in this part of the world. Then, we'll dig into 2 critical vulnerabilities that really define the whole conflict. After that, we're going to trace the ripple effect, all the way from a drop of oil to your own wallet. And finally, we'll look at the incredibly dangerous game of chicken this all leads to.
Okay, so it all starts right here, with this one tiny, almost absurdly important strip of water. I mean, at its narrowest point, the Strait of Hormuz is only about 33 kilometers wide. But trust me, its small size completely betrays its massive importance.
And this number, this is the reason why. Roughly 20% of the entire world's oil supply flows through that little narrow corridor every single day. So this isn't just another shipping lane, it is one of the most critical geographic choke points on the entire planet. Period. Now here's what's really fascinating. Look at where all that oil is going. It is the absolute lifeblood for Asia's biggest economies. We're talking China, India, Japan, South Korea. They don't just buy oil from the Gulf, they completely depend on it to function. So if this strait gets closed or even just becomes too risky to sail through, the shock isn't regional, it's immediate and it's global.
And that brings us to this really interesting kind of core imbalance of the situation. You see, each side's greatest strength is basically the other's greatest weakness. It's a perfect and frankly terrifying mirror image.
So we all know the story, right? Gulf states export oil, lots of it. But what do they import? Well, pretty much everything else. Food, construction materials, consumer goods, everything you need to sustain modern life. The very same sea lanes that carry all that oil out are the ones bringing the essentials in. It's not just a trade route. For them, it's a life support system.
This contrast right here really lays out the whole strategic dilemma. On one hand, you have Iran. Its mountainous terrain creates this amazing natural defense, a place to hide missiles, conceal launch sites, you name it. But on the other side, you have the Gulf states. All of their critical infrastructure is packed together in flat coastal areas. It's visible, it's stationary, and it's incredibly hard to protect.
So what are those targets we're talking about? I mean, these are the things that literally keep these societies running. Desalination plants for their fresh water, oil terminals that are the source of all their wealth, and the ports, the entry point for their food. If you disrupt these, you're not just attacking an economy, you're attacking the basic ability of a modern city to even exist.
But, and this is a huge but, Iran has its own Achilles heel. While its terrain is a fortress on the outside, it's a country facing immense internal strain. We're talking chronic water shortages, crushing economic sanctions, and some really fragile infrastructure. So, if its dams or power grids start to fail, that mountain fortress can turn into a pressure cooker real fast.
All right, so you can see the local tinderbox. Now let's zoom out and see how the tiniest spark there could set the whole world on fire. A conflict here does not stay regional for long. It sends shockwaves through the entire global financial system.
The sequence of events is just brutally simple, like a line of dominoes. A conflict in the strait kicks off an immediate energy and supply shock. That shock, of course, leads to financial chaos as markets panic. And that financial crisis very quickly becomes a global political one.
And right at the heart of all this is something called the Petro-Dollar system. To put it simply, oil is priced and sold in US dollars. What that does is create this constant, built-in global demand for the dollar. So the stability of the Gulf is directly tied to the financial system that underpins American economic power.
And all that cash the Gulf states make, they don't just, stick it in a vault. They recycle it. Their huge sovereign wealth funds are massive investors in global markets. They own real estate, they fund projects, they provide the cash that keeps everything from the US stock market to tech startups humming along.
But what happens when a major war breaks out? Well, that switch gets flipped instantly. They're forced to go from investment mode to survival mode, and that means pulling unbelievable amounts of money out of global markets to pay for defense, to rebuild, and to just manage the crisis at home. And listen, this is probably the most important thing to get. A withdrawal of that much capital doesn't just mess with Wall Street, it hits Main Street. When that much cash, that much liquidity dries up, it can impact everything from the value of tech stocks all the way down to the stability of your own retirement account.
So this brings us to the end game. Because a conflict here isn't really about who can win in the traditional sense, it's about who can withstand the most pain before they're just forced to break.
I think this quote from our source material just sums it up perfectly. It's a brutal game of chicken, where both sides have the power to inflict absolutely devastating damage on the other, and both of them know it.
It's not about who can throw the biggest punch. The real question is, who can take the biggest punch? The Gulf is vulnerable because its infrastructure is all out in the open. Iran is vulnerable because of its internal fragility. So the real conflict becomes a contest of pure endurance, a test of a government's stability, a society's resilience, and just sheer political will.
And this is where things get really scary, because once you start climbing that escalation ladder, where does it stop? At what point does a regime feeling like its very survival is on the line start to consider choices that were previously unthinkable? It stops being about what's likely and starts being about what's terrifyingly possible. And that's really what makes this one single choke point so incredibly dangerous. When you look at the map, when you look at all the dependencies and the vulnerabilities, it all boils down to this one terrifyingly simple question. In this high-stakes global game of chicken, who blinks first?